few weeks ago, a researcher, very well known, actually, neuroscientist, Dr. Wu Ying, committed suicide. And the National Institute of Health formally declared that many of the researchers have found that there have been discriminatory practices and really a lot of emotional and psychological pressure on Asian Americans, especially those of the Chinese descent. This is nothing new. We've known that this has been happening after Donald Trump, while he was president, launched a program to target Asian American, especially Chinese Americans, for national security reasons, quote unquote. And thereafter, there have been other legislation in US Congress targeting the same, and even more ridiculous, targeting the Chinese government in terms of whether or not they had influence over researchers to capture US information or science and technology secrets. Now, for someone who's been, I guess, subject to the same thing more than 50 years ago, I can actually talk quite a bit about this because I remember the days of Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King leading demonstrations for civil rights against discrimination. I remember in 1968, the massive march on Washington. At that time, America talks about everybody being equal, human rights for all, and so on and so forth. But sorry, the N-word, you go to the back of the bus, or you don't even get a seating. And the N-word was prevalent all over, and it was commonly used. But it's nothing new for Asian Americans either, because at that same period, during that same period, you had many expressions used, derogatory expressions used against Asian Americans. Many of you probably have not heard of the expressions used at that time. And I was subject to exactly that. That continued on until today. But now it's become an international thing. It's China, 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 Chinese Communist Party. But behind it all, underneath it all, is still racism and discrimination. A couple of years ago, fellow alumni of my alma mater, Princeton University, was putting together a scholarship fund for Chinese students to study at Princeton. And eventually, the thing was dropped because we were told, let's not say by whom, but let's say by university officials, that there is a discriminatory practice against foreign students from China, where FBI required reports on a regular basis on their activities. And even university officials were unhappy about what they had to do and were absolutely outraged by the discriminatory practices being imposed on them by the US government. Of course, we know that this US government has now other regulations coming out and, come and study in the US, pay full tuition, but don't touch the sciences. You can study the non-science subject. It's really amazing when you think about it. I think back 50 years, more than 50 years ago, when Dr. Martin Luther King and against the war in Vietnam and demonstrations against the bombings in Cambodia and so on and so forth, going back over 50 years. And now the very same, however under a different guise, is now being practiced as racial discrimination seems to be so deeply ingrained in this country of the US that all the talk about equality and the human rights and so on and so forth just seems so hypocritical.